I started at Rutgers in the fall of '64, so that would be the class of '68. It was an interesting transition for me going to college too. Everything was sort of a shiny object for me in those years. I still, still just a young kid from the coal mines in Scotland. Come my senior year, it suddenly dawned on me, I don't know where my head was before that I was going to graduate very soon and there was a war going on. Uh, I had not been political. I had not been active in the movement one way or the other. By that time, it was obvious that this was not a good situation. It was not a good war, which shouldn't have started and it shouldn't still be going on, and I didn't want to have any part of it. But I also realized after going to a few job interviews that my draft status was the first question that came up. I guess they were allowed to ask these kind of questions in those days. And of course, it was 1A. I'd never had a sick day in my life. And I wasn't married. There was nothing that would keep me out of the military. And through a roundabout way, I found out that I was going to be drafted immediately by the Patterson Draft Board, which was where our home was. So I said, oh, wow, what am I going to do now, This was the spring of my senior year in 1968. 1968 was not a good year to graduate. It was the highest draft year since World War II, perhaps with an exception of the Korean War. But when the shoe finally dropped that I was going to be in the military, I thought my father was a pilot in the RAF. I'd always been interested in airplanes. I always had model airplanes in my room in Scotland. So I figured, well, I'll go talk to the Air Force, take a little bit of initiative here, rather than ending up as a grunt in the jungle, so to speak. Qualifying for Air Force flight school composed of two components. One was a 6-hour aptitude test. That was a fairly unique aptitude test, testing for qualities you would need as a pilot, say. That was, and then of course the physical. I hadn't been sick a day in my life in the physical, so I figured no problem with the physical. And I passed the 6-hour aptitude test, and I didn't hear, and I didn't hear, and I didn't hear, and I took the physical. It was in McGuire Air Force Base, and doing my finals, I'm graduating in a week or two. I still hadn't heard from them, and I walked into the Air Force recruiting station, and these two guys that had been kissing my feet for like 4 months. They wouldn't meet my eyes eye to eye, and they said, yeah, we just got your results back this morning. And and they said, you were rejected. And I said, rejected? On what? We said, rejected on the basis of insufficient teeth. And he had my folder in front of him, and he turned it around, and sure enough, you have the upper teeth and the lower teeth, and there's X's where you have teeth missing. And he said, well, you're allowed X teeth missing, and you have Y teeth missing. And I thought, poor. And I remember standing there with my tongue counting where I had teeth missing. Good old Scottish dentist. Let's hear it for Scottish dentist. I was only 22 years old and I already had half a mouthful gone. I'd never given it a thought, frankly, myself. So I went next door to the Marine office, and there was a Marine gunny sergeant sitting there, and I told him my story. He said, yeah, unfortunately it would be the same for Navy flight school. And he said, where you have teeth pulled, it's regarded as scar tissue and liable to bleed at high altitudes or high G-forces. And he said, but having said that, if you got to that status while you were on flight status, they wouldn't pull you off a plane. And he said, but unfortunately, that's a criteria. So I didn't get to flight school to be a jet jockey, if you will. And the interesting thing about that story is, in the 50 years since then, I've talked to many people, including military dentists, that say that's the strangest thing they've ever heard of. And it's interesting how these fickle little things change the entire direction of your life. So I thought maybe let's take the approach of trying to outschool the war. So we're in the middle of '68. So if I had just allowed myself to be drafted and with no further action, I would be in Vietnam in 4 months. But I volunteered to go to officer candidate school, which took another 6 months. And then I addressed that flying itch and volunteered to go to flight school for the Army. The Army, of course, doesn't fly high speeds or high G-forces, so they didn't care how many teeth I had missing. So that took me almost 2 years worth of school. Took me through to the summer of 1970. And unfortunately, it was still going on. So I ended up in Vietnam. So I landed in Saigon, and there's a huge. There was two clearing areas in Vietnam where you go and you're processed, if you will. Yeah, they just dump everybody in these two locations, and from there you get your specific orders to various units within country. And I was assigned to randomly what was called the 135th Aviation, which was an experimental military unit, EMU, EMU, which is an Australian bird that can't fly, ironically. And as it turned out, it was a unit, a combat assault helicopter company that was half Royal Australian Navy and half U.S. Army. And it had been formed 4 years before as an experiment, just in cooperation and working together. And it had survived as a fighting functional unit. And it was working in the Mekong Delta. So that was my area of operations. So for the first 4 months, I flew what we called slicks, and that was part of your normal processing. A slick was a helicopter, a Huey, which is 2 door gunners, and it was used to transport mainly people, or use combat assaults to take troops. You alternated days. One day you would do resupply to various outposts, flying alone, and the alternate day you would do combat assault with Vietnamese army and taking them in and taking them in the landing zones. I'll never forget the first day I was flying. It's one of these days that just is branded in your brain. I was flying what we would call a resupply, just a one ship. We were just doing individual tasks, if you will, and we landed at a base camp that was close to the river that had been an artillery base camp. Artillery fire bases were relatively isolated locations, so they were very susceptible to being attacked and overrun in some cases. And so this artillery base had been overrun the night before. And one of the main defenses for artillery base camps is a flechette, or shells that are filled with thousands of little nails. And as soon as they come out, there's thousands of nails just spread everywhere. And despite the fact that they were overrun, there was, I don't know, there had to be a lot of VC dead there. And they all had these nails, like, an inch apart on them. And they were just piled everywhere. And the reason we had landed there was to evacuate some prisoners. And there was three young men, Viet Cong apparently, I didn't know. They were trying to force them onto our plane, and for some reason their parents were there. Their mothers were there, and there was one old woman that was absolutely going crazy because she probably had a good sense that she was never going to see her son again. And they got on the plane, and they had to physically pull her off, and she got off and she grabbed the skids of the plane. And it's my first day, and so we flew him to a higher echelon base camp and dropped them off. Who knows what happened to them, but that was my first day, and I'm thinking, this is going to be a long year, After 4 months, I could elect to fly to gunships, which I did. So I flew helicopter gunships the remainder of the tour. I didn't do that basically because I was bloodthirsty or gung-ho or whatever reason. I just thought I was there. I was being shot at every day, and so why not just have at least a way to respond to gunfire? That was about as basic as it was. It wasn't any more dangerous or less dangerous than flying a slick, but obviously as a gunship you tend to be where all the action is, just by the very nature of your task. So for the remainder of the term I flew gunships. We used to, as I said, insert a lot of Arvin trips. We used to work with the Navy SEALs, and first 4 or 5 times I worked with them, I saw them, but I saw them getting in the slicks, and I saw them talking to the CNCs, but I never actually talk to one of them directly. We would escort them, and they were inserted in the jungle, and we would provide fire support for them. And then one day we had a massive operation with them in the Yumen forest, and there was a lot of seals, more than I had seen at any one time. And actually, we were in the briefing room with them, and the two SEAL officers, I can't remember their rank, were giving the briefing. These guys were like college professors. I just like totally shattered my my perception of these grunts, these Rambo guys. I was very impressed with them, and they were very easy, good people to work with. But it was a fairly dicey experience. We used to get shot at on a regular basis. The time I have a Purple Heart, there's a little story with the Purple Heart. They gave it to me, so no arguments. But it was the Purple Heart is wounded under action with, I can't remember the exact words, but wounded in action by enemy fire. The day that occurred, we had been, as a gunship, we had been escorting a combat assault by Vietnamese troops. And we started taking fire, a lot of fire, before we got to the LZ, but we were still very low. And so as the gunships, we diverted ourselves to go to where the gunfire was coming and address it. And as we were flying down into it, we started taking a lot of fire through the front of the ship. Glass bubbles were flying, windshields were getting blown out. And our door gunners, who should have their M60 on a rack that prevents the barrel from going in dangerous directions, they didn't like that loss of flexibility, so they used to hang them by belts so they can get around. Where, as I was in a rocket dive, my foot got blown off the pedal, and I'd obviously been hit by a bullet. And I said, I'm being hit, I'm pulling off. And I hear this meek little voice coming off from behind my door gunner. He says, "Sir," he says, "I think it was me." I said, "What?" He had been hanging out the edge of the door underneath. He was trying to shoot underneath in front of us, and his barrel had whacked against the door. And the bullet actually didn't go through my foot. It sliced the boot. You could see the slice from the boot where it went through on the edge of the boot, but it had gone through the door. So there was about 200 pieces of the door in my foot. So I pulled away, and they operated as too major a word. They pulled out half the pieces of metal, and the other parts are still in there. Most of them are worked out now, but. So it wasn't an enemy bullet, as they say, but it was as a result of enemy action where my guy accidentally shot me. So that was the story behind my Purple Heart. I have a Distinguished Flying Cross, which is for valor, and I was awarded that as a result of a very busy day in the Yumen forest. The Yumen forest was in the center of the Mekong Delta. The Mekong Delta is the delta of the Mekong. It's the part of the country south of Saigon. It's the heaviest populated part of the country, and it's the most productive agricultural area. But it's a lot of open rice fields. But in the center of it's the Yumen Forest, which was a home for a lot of VC and North Vietnamese. And we had a major operation in there where twice within the span of about an hour and a half, I was in a position where there was a combat assault going on, and the lead helicopter got shot down. So it had crash landed with a load of infantry, and it was getting overrun. So I just happened to be on the spot with my wingman, and we were able to hold off the bad guys, and as a matter of fact, disperse them so that the rescue troops could come in and save the guys that were, shot down. And about 2 hours later, not very far away, a Loach had been shot down. A Loach is a light observation helicopter. A Loach is this little bubble and these were the craziest pilots in Vietnam. They would hover over tunnels and drop hand grenades in tunnels. These guys, it was very agile little plane that would zip zap along trails and what have you. And they had been shot down too, and they were also in a position where they were getting overrun. They weren't going to be able to, save themselves before anybody was able to get to them. So again, we were in the vicinity, and we were able to hold off the bad guys long enough so that they could be rescued. So that happened in one day, a few hours apart. So that ended up in the Distinguished Flying Cross. It's interesting when you're flying helicopters in a hostile environment. It's amazing how many rounds you can take, how many bullets can come through your airplane, and nothing can happen. And then you come back and you find all these holes all over the plane that you were aware were coming in, but the plane was still functioning fine. Ironically, the one time I was literally shot down was I only had two bullets come into the plane, but one of them hit the fuel governor, which controls the RPM of the rotor blade, which without that, and we were very low. I was flying gunships. We weren't above treetop height very often. We were pretty low. And so I belly flopped into what I thought was a grass field. It turned out, though, it was elephant grass that was 10, 12 feet tall. And I sunk right into it. And the bottom of that, there was 2 feet of water. So the only thing that was visible, quite literally, was the rotor above the, the top of the roof and the rotor. And given how low you are, you're very close to the guys that shot you down. So you're immediately in danger when you're on the ground. And our 2 dodo gunners, they immediately jumped out, grabbed their M60s and got on the roof, and were watching out for anybody. And I think, given the fact, the story I was telling you about how we rescued some downed airplanes, we were in the reverse of that situation, where thankfully very quickly some helicopter gunships started doing low loops around us and kept, these guys didn't have to shoot. We actually had to shoot the bad guys when the situation was reversed. But very quickly we were rescued, and a big Chinook come up and lifted the plane away. So you could never tell what would happen. Our casualties weren't, we were shot at a lot, and we were wounded quite a lot. There weren't too many deaths. So I must say, my mailbox, they put us 3 to a mailbox, the officers, the pilots, and I was the only one that got home from my mailbox. And when you think of, if somebody had told me only one of you is going home when I went there, I wouldn't have bet on my odds. So I think all things considered, it was a pretty lucky thing.